I'd like to invite Dr. Whitney Kelting up onto the stage to give her paper. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you for bearing up under more of me. Twice in under 24 hours is an awful lot of Kelting, but I think you'll bear with me. So today I'm actually have the when I got my first email about this conference, it was such a joyful thought to actually take a moment and go back and look at where my research on Jains began, actually, because lately I haven't actually been working on things directly related to song. Music is always a part of how I see and collect information, but it isn't what I'm writing about right now. And so it's really lovely to have an opportunity to go back and spend some time with some old material and think about things that I continue to collect field data on the music, even if I haven't been writing on it. So I actually got a chance to use some of that material too. So I was actually very pleased to have this opportunity, and thank you all for inviting me. So I'm actually going to stick a little closer to text than sometimes because I have samples and I want to make sure I get them in the right spot. So over the last decades of research with the Svetambar Murtipujak Jain community in Pune, I've been in a unique position to track changes in the performance. I have really, this is no exaggeration, a couple thousand hours of Jain music over the last 23 years. And some of which has been beautifully made nice and cleaned up for production and listening, and some has not. But because of this, I have had a chance to trace differences over time. And when I got asked to speak here, I thought, well, that is actually the right thing for me to do for this conference. What is different between the very first stavan I heard and the most recent one? What's happened? And it turned out to be very fruitful because the very first stavan that I actually ever heard is a stavan called, its actual name is the Sri Shankeshwar Parshva stavan, but it's often referred to as Antarajami Sunanavesa, okay? Because it's very popular, and there's another stavan with a similar name in the formal sense. So it's usually referred to in this other name. And this stavan turns out to be one that has great durability. So it turned out to be that the very first stavan that I ever heard is actually one that I hear every single time I'm in India. Absolutely never fail to hear it. So it's a good way to think about change over time using this particular song. I'm going to actually step away from it at one point because I'm going to play you a sample of a group singing because it got mentioned in the morning and I thought you might want to hear it, and I happen to have some on my phone. So I'm going to play you one slightly random sample later. I'll tell you when we're there. But I want to start by playing the first stavan recording I ever made. So my intention was to go to India and study Jains, and I was interested in looking at changes in political economy and how that manifested in institution building. I'm actually now doing that. I got completely sidetracked. Really a 20-year sidetrack, because I was sitting with my Gujarati teacher, who was actually a Pushtimar Hindu, and she said to me, my friend is coming from Bombay, she's Jain, you ought to meet her. And I said, great. So she came over, and I spent the day with her, and she said, oh, have you ever, she found out I was a singer, I'm a musician. She said, have you ever heard our songs? And I said, no, but I know that they exist, but I've never heard them. And she said, well, let me sing you one. Turn on your recorder, she said like this. I want to play you that recording, actually. Let's see if it works. Fingers crossed, everybody? I'm not hearing her. Hold on, I see action, but I do not hear sound. Hold on. Pause. We lost our guy before we had resolved this one question. So the volume is up here. Yeah. That's good. It's good on my phone.
This is plugged in. Should that not be?
She had it a minute ago. And I was playing it.
So I get it on my phone.
Let's see, in your phone.
My phone is here. It's right here.
You can hold the phone up to the mic if...
I could, and that's possibly the worst sound we could come up with, but like the only sound we could come up with.
Better than no sound at all.
It's true. So I am going to...
Is it on Wi-Fi?
I'm going to do that because I don't want to waste any more of your time. So, here is a very badly produced way of doing this, but hopefully you can get something of the effect of it. Yeah. Here we go.
अर्ज करे राज अमने शिव सुख आपो आपो ने महाराज अमने मोक्ष सुख आपो सबको नामन वंचित पूरो चिंता सहोनी चूरे एवं विरुद्ध छे राज तुम्हारू केम राखो छो दूरे सेवक अर्ज करे छे राज अमने शिव सुख आपो 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 ने महाराज अमने मोक्ष सुख आपो
I know, it's so hard to stop. I love that song so much. And in fact, I decided immediately to learn it at the time, and I was like, I have to learn that song. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. And I've been singing my whole life. So that's hearing that song grabbed my attention, and it actually changed the direction of my field research. I went back to my graduate school advisor and said, I actually need to get trained as an ethnomusicologist. And he said, what? And I said, yeah, I'm changing my topic. And fortunately, my advisor was a very, very supportive professor. And he said, okay. And I spent an extra year at grad school and got the training that I needed to do it, which was not enormously surprising. I had been a professional musician, so a lot of that was in place. So anyway, so in the 24 years since I made that recording, sitting in a living room of my Gujarati teacher's house, I have actually recorded countless performances of this stavan. Stavan is the word for this kind of hymn. I can't even tell you. I counted off the top of my head. In my first year, I think I recorded it something like 75 times. And I wasn't actually looking for it. I was just doing it in recording context. And today I'm going to center the stavan because I think it's useful. Okay, so in general, I'm going to talk first about some musicality, then we'll talk about performance. So in general, musically, instrumentation of stavan falls into three categories. One, which I just played for you now, which is solo voice, usually a single person or a small group. Usually a single person, or sometimes you'll have a sort of someone who's in charge of the song, and then a couple of people singing with them. This is a standard performance practice. And that's usually, that is probably numerically the greatest number of performances. Okay. There are also group performances that are, you saw a photograph of a women's singing group. It's actually not my photo, it's a great photo. Thank you for having that. And they were sitting in 2 rows and they had a single double-headed drum, and then they also had, which you may not have been able to see, but I know what I'm looking for. They had on the ground hand cymbals, the tambourine, and the sticks that are also used for Raskarava dandiya dancing. Okay, and these idiophones, those hand percussion, are used as part of the singing tradition when women sing it in groups. Okay, and then the third version of it is a version. Oh, they also do a lot of clapping and hand snapping. And then the third version that you see is something that looks more like what you were talking about, with the shift towards performing with instrumentation, having, first of all, having microphones, having sometimes harmoniums, sometimes dolak. Sometimes women will play a dolak. You'll hear that once in a while. and sometimes having electronic synthesizer kind of sound at it. Not so, they tended to go straight to the electronic and skipping the acoustic harmonium a lot of the time. Partly, I think, because of the expense of playing, of getting harmonium. They're actually not a cheap instrument. And so in these three models, we have three different performances, and they go from the most common, the solo singer, the middle level, which is usually the women's group singing, and then the least common, but also very high prestige public performance, which is often accompanied by these other instrumentation. And it's usually a solo singer. There is an intermediary space where sometimes you'll have men's group singing, and they will also be singing and using idiophones, but also microphone. So the microphone, it was interesting that you were talking about the mics being turned off on the women, because microphones is a very gendered, in my experience of research, a super gendered experience. And so in these forms of instrumentation, we have a different sound. And this is the piece that I wasn't planning on playing for you, but that I will just give you a really brief sample because it was brought up.
Whitney, you should be able to play it over your iPhone now.
Oh,
the tech has.
Cool. All right. Whoop. That's not the one I thought I had. Hold on for a second. Let me do a couple of things. Bear with me. I hope that it is all worth it in the end, and that you will say to yourself, oh, there are the pictures of my kid again. Okay. So cute. I can't wait to tell him he was totally present at my thing. Okay. This is my pen, right? Okay, good, because I stuck it in my mouth. Okay, so this is a classic sample of performance of a stavan in a women's singing group, if I am correct about which cut this is. No. Nope. All right.
Not happening.
That's all right. We can do it over here. I always say, one of the great things about being a performer is, and I was for a long time, is everything that could go wrong, I've been there. So. This is another couple. I should actually give credit for this. This is the Sri Parshva Mandal of Shivaji Nagar in Pune. And the solo performer was Niruben Shah from Dombivli out west in Bombay. So that is just, if you want to, that's what a classic, it really does sound like so many of them. A women's mandal singing in a temple in a regular setting. And the only difference really was that I had a tape recorder there. And it was a normal kind of a regular morning Sanatra Puja, and not a particular, it was very casual. People were coming and going during it. But I just wanted you to hear a sample of what that might sound like since you saw a photograph of it. Okay, so when we think about, sorry, I turned the page a little early. When we think about the instrumentation there, we also want to think a little bit about some of the things that aren't there. So what we don't see a lot of the time are either melodic percussion like tabla, and you don't hear also drones. And that is, I think, significant when we think about the relationship, when we think about the difference between like Hindustani classical traditions or even Haveli Sangeet and Shabad Kirtan, like how these actually sound more influenced by the kind of classical tradition and that bringing with it the drone. These are not using the drone in it at all, and they're also not using melodic instrumentation other than voice. Okay, and so what we can see is that it's most closely related to, if you listen around, it's most closely related to other genres of performance that you hear in Western India in religious context, particularly the singing of Garvas. It's very clearly connected to that, and actually a lot of shared melodic material, a lot of shared melodies. But you'll also see some connections with Tamil music, and also some connections with some of the Rajasthani folk music in the performances by Marwari groups, but not so much in the Gujarati groups, except when they want to play an exotic Marwari tune, which you do see sometimes, because they're kind of fun and different. And they're considered difficult because they're someone else's, in the way that that playing Raskarva melodies is very, very comfortable for them. You also see, one of the things that you'll notice about it too is the vocal tone. Although it's higher in pitch than English singing happens in, this is not particularly high pitched for Indian female vocals. And I say that for those of you who may not be aware of it. They're singing in what is very close to actually their speaking voices. Their speaking voices are actually fairly high pitched compared to mine. Okay, but people who actually have lower speaking voices will sing lower, so there isn't an attempt to sing up in a high soprano register. And you also, it's relatively not nasal for, there's maybe a little bit ethnomusicology geekiness, but it's relatively not nasal for the region also. It's what I would call a little bit more throaty, although one of the singers is in the sample of the group, she's more nasal than most of them. And so that is also an aesthetic that you're going to hear if you go to women's performances of wedding songs or of other forms of folk music in Western India, that you don't get the kind of high-pitched nasal that you're going to get from either the classical traditions, the light classical, or the Bombay film music. Okay, you get a different timbre in the vocal tone. This matters because it's actually changing. So it's one of the things I want to talk about today. When I first went to India in '93, the women all, to a pretty high degree, sang with low nasality and not that much ornamentation. Niruben sung with the first clip with a little bit more ornamentation than average, but solo singers have that luxury. As a person who, I was trained up in two solo a cappella traditions traditionally from my family, and in both cases there's a lot more ornamentation when you sing solo because you're not relying on somebody else and your timing is your own. They also, as solo performers, do not stick to a strict time signature, and that's also common in Western Indian folk music, and as well as in other folk musics in the world. But over time, we see that there are recordings, and I expected, guided by Peter Manuel's work and other people's work on recordings, I expected to find standardization in melody and in repertoire through the use of recordings and production of cassettes and so forth. And I did find that, but not as quickly as I had anticipated. So at the time in '93, there was one woman singer, Sheila Shetya, who was widely distributed. There was another woman, Induben, she was sometimes distributed, but not as widely. But she was very widely distributed, and she did conform to the folk timbre and style of singing, although she was much more regulated in her time signature, so it was much more steady, like the group, right? Because the group uses the drum in order to keep everybody in time, whereas a single vocalist, and if you notice, she would sometimes take longer between notes and so forth, and that's something that is hard to do in a group, so that's why they use the drum to do that. Okay. I actually think the use of the drum in the group singing is also done because, in fact, most of them don't sing to a steady time signature when they sing solo, and so they will not naturally fall in line without the drum. In a way that people who always sing in a steady time signature, it's a lot easier to get them to sing in a steady time signature without a drum. But that's a sort of a side note. So over time, though, the recordings, I noticed that the younger people were influenced more by the recordings. And some of this happened because while they were doing their preparations for performances during festivals, they would use a recording as the basis for their performance of dance or group singing. And so that helped train them into a standardization of the song. So I want to play you a sample of a singer. This is Sonali Shah. She is of Pune. She comes from a family with a great number of singers in it. This is her at, I believe she is 16 at the time of this recording. She's either 15 or 16 at the time of this recording. This is her in the house, and she said, oh, I'm going to sing you my favorite stavan, because I was recording people that day, and so here she is.
जन्म मरण दुख बारो सेवक अर्ज करे जे राज अमने शिव सुख आपो 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 ने महाराज अमने मोक्ष सुख आपो सबको नामन वांछित पूरो चिंता सहुनी चूरो रे एवो विरुद्ध जे राज तमारो केम राखो छो दूरे सेवक अर्ज करे जे राज अमने शिव सुख आपो सेवक ने वन वन तू देखी मन
She actually forgot to sing the chorus. Cute. So if you were my students, I'd be like, okay, so what was different? But one of the things that I noticed immediately is when I played them again, is how steady her meter is. It's very steady meter. And in fact, she was tapping her foot to make sure she stayed steady. A concern that certainly her grandmother sitting next to her, who was kind of rolling her eyes a little bit, would never have worried about, right? Because you sing it sort of as it's felt in the old meters. But also, you'll notice that she is, it's much quicker. In fact, it actually changes time signature in the chorus and the verse, and she can't quite make it work because she's trying to make it be the same. And so she's actually a little bit rushed in the chorus because it actually has an additional, if you think of meter from a shlok meter model, it actually has an additional 4 beats. And she has to shove them into the time signature because she's trying to make it work right. And that all comes from this desire to sort of standardize the performance, right? To make it very standard. She also is singing in what I think of as a sweet voice, which is up in the mouth a little bit more, less down in the throat. She's young, so it's clean. I mean, you don't have throat noise that you get when you get vocal nodules like I do. So your vocal timbre will change, but she's definitely trying to sing it in the way that I think of it when you teach singing is singing pretty. She's singing pretty, which is different from singing in a fancy way, or from not just from the heart, but also because not just from the heart, but also a sense of virtuosity. Because Nirubin was absolutely singing in a way that was intended to show virtuosity as well as the beauty of the song. She's just singing. In a sense, she's singing pretty. She's quite a good singer, especially for a young singer. But we can see how standard it is, right? We can hear that in her voice. And she is singing it. She learned the song from her grandmother, but she had been listening to the cassette of Sheila Shetty, and she was like, listen, I can sing it like her. So she was starting to model on the recording instead of her grandmother, who was like, it was a fantastic moment. So we see some changes in the tempo, and she was a little nervous, and that might have affected the tempo a little bit. Although she had been recorded, I've known her since she was 11 years old. She's been recorded many times. In these changes too, though, there's a more subtle change that if you have to be a little bit more of a music geek to notice. But if you notice that the other thing that's happening is if you are used to listening to contemporary music or Western music, you're used to hearing the notes in a tempered scale. And so Nirubin might have sounded to your ear a little off. If you've listened to a lot of Indian music, you're used to this. But to when I play this for students, she sounds a little bit like she's missing something. Sometimes she's a little off. That's actually not what's going on at all. She's working in an untempered scale. And the later recording of the young woman, she has, as Sheila Shetty had, scaled it to a tempered scale. And that means that the notes separation is even, and it changes some of the notes just a little bit. And you don't notice it unless you listen to them right next to each other. Then you notice it. Or you hear two people singing together. So if she sang with her grandmother, you'd hear the difference in their performances. They'd be slightly different. So when I went back and made that recording, I was struck by some changes, and that was just a few years later. So when I go back every year, I often make recordings, really performances all the time. And so one of the delights also is that if I get my recorder out, lots of people will sing who don't normally. And so what's nice about that is that I also have recordings that are not necessarily every family's best singer. But what I do get is everybody's favorite song or best song. And that's part of what makes me think about this particular stavan is it is sung over and over again, because even if people are not particularly brave singers, they probably know this one. There's about 5 or 6 stavan that most people have at least pretty decent familiarity with, and I have many, many more recordings of those than some of the more unusual ones because of that. Now I want to talk a little bit, so that's the musicality. Now I want to talk about performance context. So solo performance of stavan is the dominant performance style, in part because it is what's done in temples in the morning in solo performance during worship. The recitation of morning worship includes a spot in which a stavan is intended to be sung, but some people who don't even do the whole recitation may actually sing either in front of the images or when they're actually putting sandalwood paste on the images. Sometimes you'll hear people singing to themselves. They're wearing what do we call it in English? What do we call it in English? A handkerchief. Sorry, well, a rumal. I'm like, what is that word for that? So anyway, so they're wearing, their mouth is covered, so those are a little muffled. But if you know the songs, you know what song they're singing. And so that is the most common performance. It's also what someone might do in their home. They might do it when they're sitting in a meditation. This is something people will sit and they'll sing while they're doing that, because that's one of the things you can do while you're sitting in meditation. It's also the first form of stavan singing that most children learn is solo performance from their family. So this is the root of the tradition. But we also have group performances of that style. For example, when a family goes to a temple together, or a parent with their children, or if people are at a pilgrimage site. So if you go to the pilgrimage site of Shankeshwar Parshvanath, you will hear this stavan all day long. It's a lovely, lovely experience because it is the stavan dedicated to that image. There's a couple, but it's the most popular one. And so I sat in Shankeshwar and I recorded, I think, 6 hours of that stavan being sung over and over again by groups as they came through the temple all day long. It's so great. And so these are contexts in which the performance was normal. You also have the groups performing in temples and in the context of worship. And I thought that was a really important point this morning, that Jain stavan are for the most part embedded in another ritual context. They don't do so much standalone except at night. So now I want to talk about that. So there is also the performance of stavan in a ritual context called bhavana, which is sort of joyful singing in the evening. Okay. And in that context, you will hear sometimes solo, sometimes group singing, and sometimes more professionalized singing. You'll hear all sorts of different things. And depending on the site, in pilgrimage sites, this will happen every night. In your local temple, maybe only for holidays. Okay. On pilgrimages, families will often actually perform bhavana as a group in their rooms in the dharamshala and so forth. So this is a common way that these are performed. But that was the way that you learned them, okay? So by 2000 and 2001, I noticed that a few things were different. One, that in the morning when I heard the Bhaktiamar Stotra being recited, it was actually recording now instead of grandma. And it used to be grandma reciting it, although it's still recited live in the temple. It also, stavan singing was now on recording. So actually, in some respects, I was hearing more of them in some households where singing wasn't popular. They were playing recordings. And in the past, they played Hindi film music, and now they're playing stavan because there actually were some high-quality recordings. There were also some DVDs that had photographs of temples and temple images. And when they would play, they have music in the background, and they would put those on the TV, especially if you had elderly people who can't go to the temple every day. This became a popular use of the new technology. These new recordings were different. They started to have more what I would call light classical ambition. There would be drones, tabla. The vocal quality became more nasal and more highly ornamented. And we also started to hear male voices on the recordings. In the earliest recordings that were produced and passed around, they were still all women. Okay, and this is a shift too from what's going on in terms of what the music is doing. I'm going to talk about that in my conclusion a little bit. And then in the yes, this is when I want to play you that quick sample. I've been assured that I won't get cut off if I go a little bit past the original plan because we started late and had tech trouble. We're going to use that. I'm going to use that excuse for as long as I can here. Okay, hold on. I'm going to go to let's take. Sorry about this tech, slight tech. I put this on airplane mode, that's what happened. Hoping that my child does not text me during this moment. Many of you have children, so you'll be sympathetic, I hope. Sorry about the slight tech delays. All right, so I'm just going to play you a sample of a relatively new recording. This is actually a sample that I pulled off the internet, off of Jain Devotional site. The first and most obvious difference is all the instrumentation. And they're actually doing something musically that's sort of interesting. They're using the way that Hindi films take light classical to indicate folk music. If you can sort of follow me on that one, right? So they're doing Hindi film, light classical. It's folk music, people. And this is actually a genre in Hindi film music. If you listen to it, there is a way in which they sort of gesture at folk tradition. And this is a perfect example. You'll also, if you listen, you'll notice that she's really having trouble getting the words in, because it's now constrained by the high tempo and the very, very rigid drumming, which forces her into actually a high constraint. It's almost impossible to sing along with her and stay on the words compared to, because this is where you're seeing a song that was not intended to be sung this way, being compressed really into the frame. And again, the voice is even higher pitched. It's more nasal. She's doing more of the light classical ornamenting. So this was what was everywhere from about 99 to about 2000. And then when I went back around then, I noticed probably the most radical shift in it, which is that I stopped hearing stavan in homes at all. I know, it's a little sad. Some of it was the grandmas are gone. And some of it is that there's a sort of a neo-Orthodox practice of performing more of the rituals in the temple spaces and less in the home. And so that's part of it. And part of it was actually, I said to people, are you just not listening to them anymore? I'd ask the young people, right? Well, do you not listen to them? What do you listen to? And they said, oh, I put it on my iPhone. And I say this only because what's happening is a privatization of sound, right? It's going into earphones now. So you're not hearing what the other person's listening to. And I saw a lot of that, actually. So a lot of people where the performances used to be in a public space, they're now a private experience. And when we say public, I'm talking about people together in the same kind of challenge to public-private. I thank you for bringing that up earlier, because in fact, when I think of public, I'm talking about groups of people performing in a sense where there's an audience, even if it's their own group, right? But once we get earphones and that kind of private spaces, right, music becomes then a very private event again. And so it's no longer being, in the domestic sense, a shared practice. In the temple spaces, it is still performed in the morning. But what I do notice is that with less, the repertoire is shrinking also. And I think that's because of not hearing as much of the music overall. So if that concerns you, make sure that your grandchildren learn the songs. Torture them with it, I don't know what to do. But also, I think there is a shift too. And so in conclusion, I'm going to wrap up with a couple of thoughts about what I think is going on. In some senses, Jain Stavan have quite successfully made a transition into the digital world. They're widely available in recordings and DVDs and VCDs and online, and there's no problem finding that material. But they are all exclusively this form of high-produced commercial recordings. There's no variation. I feel sometimes like they use the exact same backtrack for every single one of them. And so the only difference really is in the vocal line, which in some senses makes sense with a tradition where the vocal line was all that we really worried about. So we can almost, in some ways, I actually think of all the backtrack as all drone, because it's so continuous on a cassette. But we even have ringtones now of that stuff, by the way, which I think is a little interesting in and of itself. Because I actually heard it go off in a temple, which I thought, to me, was one of the funniest moments of my life. I'm like, wow, that's great. The stavan going off on the phone. That's so Jain. But anyway, but also that we also see a shift too in the ability to think about who is singing now. So recordings are increasingly sung by men. And they are increasingly classical training and classical driven. And this has always been the case with large-scale paid performances, but we're seeing that trickling into the recordings as they're moving around in the digital sort of universe. I think that it's interesting because in a temple, men actually rarely are singing solo. You'll hear it once in a while, but for the most part, men come in, say their recitations and leave. They don't tend to sit and sing the way that the women do because of work demands and these sort of things. But also I think because of a long-standing understanding that the auspiciousness in general, the mangalik of singing, is of women's voices singing. And so that just as women's voices are required at rites of passage, they also bless the temple in that sense of having the experience of women singing in the temple was auspicious. The hiring of a women's group to sing in your house for a housewarming puja brought auspicious singing into your house. It wasn't just the puja, which you could have done without singing, but actually having this happen. And we see, tracing across also into the Hindu world, that there is a diminished necessity seen for the singing of women as auspicious singers. The amount is shrinking. When I first went to India, a wedding, the arrival of the bride required 7 or 11 auspicious songs, and now people are pretty happy if you get 3. Right, so we're seeing a compressing of the genres across the board of women singing. So I do think that there is an element of that involved, not just in who knows songs, but also in who's getting recorded, who's singing is valuable, what that recording is doing. If the recording is serving as entertainment, then it doesn't need to be that auspicious voice. The recitation cassettes, by the way, are usually still women, even though recitation in public is often done by men. So I do think the recitation, particularly the Bhakti Marstotra recitations, are serving as mangalik in the house, and are still women's voices. It's almost always under other Portals recording. It's almost universal. Finally, in my real conclusion here, there's there's some exploration that might be worth looking at. One is, how do socioeconomic patterns change and contribute to these changes with the impact of the liberalization and shifts in the way music is consumed, right? I talked about that. What aesthetics for music there are, the global community, what are the aesthetics for your music outside of a community that's used to hearing these songs. When you play recordings of live wedding singing to people in the United States, it seems sort of cacophonous to them. It doesn't sound auspicious to them the way that it does if you see it in its context. Changes in listening patterns and changes even in general in the use of music in the public space. And I was really glad you mentioned the marching bands. The way that public space music is often linked to certain kinds of power statements. And those are generally controlled by male voices and male musicians. And so the focus on the performance of the public event in the street, kind of public event, or over loudspeakers at the temple, those voices are usually male voices. It's very rare to hear women's voices projected out into the street from a Jain temple. And then finally, also there's just some shifts in who's singing and why. There's a lot more to do, and there's a lot more focus on activities being done in nuclear families and couples, and a shift away from sex-segregated socialization. So, when I first went to India, most of the time women spent all their time almost with their female relatives and their husband's family. That all the aunts would go together to somewhere. And I'm noticing a shift towards couples going places, right? It's perceived as kind of modern and liberating for women, but actually it shifts control from women, the control over women from being controlled by women to being controlled by men. So it's not actually clear to me that we actually have anything that looks like liberalization, but there is a shift in the social dynamic, and the couple spaces are not music spaces. And the single-sex spaces were music spaces, both for men and women. Men's singing groups are actually have not dropped off as rapidly, and I think some of it is that they have more control on their free time, so they can have the couple time and the group time with the men, and the women are losing some of their women-only time, actually, except in the workspace. So these are some thoughts I have. So in terms of the last 25 years, what I am seeing is a shrinking of repertoire and standardization of performance style, but it isn't dying. It's shifting, and what's interesting to me is I don't know what that shift is going to look like. I don't know what happens when this becomes more standardized, more like classical, and the shrinking of the number of songs at the edges, but an expectation of a sort of a higher virtuosity quality to the performance. It's certainly still happening, and to go back to the original recording, that song I still hear that song every day. And so what I think we're going to find is that and that's actually one of the oldest songs that's still in active repertoire. There's a series of very, very old stavan that are still sung, and this is one of them. And I think that they carry this special Jain character that separates them from other genres of music, and they will actually survive, is my guess, because they actually mark somebody's identity as Jain. I know these very important old songs. And that they will perpetuate in a way that some of the mid-level songs may actually vanish. But I will stop with that. Thank you very much. I ran a little over, so I don't know if I can.
It's up to your engine.
We're fine, because we have extra time, I think, with the end discussion.
Okay, I don't want to. I just want to make sure I'm not cutting the next talk short.
I know you hate me already, so.
No.
Take my time, yes.
You'll get your time, I promise. I'll take questions. Sure, in the back.
Interesting paper. I have a technical question. Could you figure out during your ethnographic fieldwork whether the songs are based on ragas, even though are folk ragas, or did you analyze in terms of music?
Oh yeah, so I did. I know where most of the melodies that we're looking at come from in the genre, and most of them go to, not this particular one. I'll talk about this particular one. Most of them go back to designated wedding or Ras Garba melodies, and they're native. We sing this to this song, and so I have talked to people who look in some of the older sort of rag traditions, but that is not a preoccupation. And in fact, even to the point where they very rarely use the word rag, they usually say torj, actually for the designation. And I think it's because they are linked onto other songs. The ties are much stronger to the folk traditions. And the folk traditions may have connections with rags, but my suspicion is the rags are written, or the folk tradition gets a name as a rag rather than the other direction, right? That there's a song that, oh, there's that melody for that, and then we're going to name it something, right? Right, yeah. But they're not particularly concerned with conforming, and they don't use any of those classical. There's only one in one of the parts of the Snatra Puja. They say Rag Danyashari, but otherwise that's the only time. And because they actually do it in that one case, it's striking to me that they never do it in the rest of them.
It would be an interesting way to.
Yeah, and I've played them for people who are historians. Yeah. Yeah, and so it tends to be passed on by melody rather than by rhyme.
And then the other question, these songs based on a responsorial form, like you have a lead singer and then the group repeating the same text. I couldn't get whether they were.
Okay, so I'll look some of each. Okay, so what happens in solo performance? No, even when it's a group of maybe 3 or 4, they just sing in unison. Once you have a group, you start to have some response to her. So the sample that I gave you, she sang some of it so in a solo form, and then she sang a part where they jumped in. They practice, they know when to jump in. But you will, in like a pilgrimage site or in a Bhavana at night, have response thing, and the same songs will be sung different ways. There are some songs that are sung as solo pieces, and they have a different arrangement when they're sung in group setting because of the call and response model. So there's a really popular one, Dekhi Shri Parshvanath, which is constantly sung in both solo and group performances, and it sounds very different in those two. This stavan that I played you today is almost never sung in a response form. I think I've heard it maybe twice in 20-something years, because it doesn't really lend itself to it. And so what happens is it's usually a solo performance or a unison performance.
I think that the analysis of the traditional repertoire would help to preserve it.
Oh, absolutely. And I actually think that the traditional repertoire, one of the things that's different about those older songs, I think, is that because they are so irregular, that they actually haven't become the standard group songs anyway, because they're actually, it's awkward to try to make them work. It's 1 or 2 that have succeeded, like Dekhi is one of them, but for the most part, they don't. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk for yesterday and today. So most of the songs that you presented, I believe, were Gujarati songs, and I wanted to know more about, the Rajasthani Marwari influences, or the different types of songs and how they're different. And obviously with Mandir Margi versus Stanakvasi, and within the Stanaks you may not have as many songs, as many, because of...
you have more,
so I wanted to know your experience, because where I've been to Stanaks, you hear the songs, or, in the family setting, but again, not as much with, depending on the route of, where we're going for more of a practical aspect of not using the music and not using the songs to, not harm microorganisms, and not going down that path, or not using microphones.
Right. You don't see the recording
even,
and stuff.
That kind of thing. So how does that contradiction, does that really exist? And what other forms have you seen within the Rajasthani styles, within other styles of music? And basically I want to know your experience on the different aspects of what you've seen.
That's a great question. So Stanakavasis actually sing quite a bit.
Yes.
They sing a lot. They don't use, they will sometimes use bells, but they don't use drums, because it's the skins, even though actually the drums that the women I know use actually don't have skins. But because of the history of drums and skins, I think that's really where that comes from. And they don't, if there's a renouncer in the room, nobody will use amplification. And that's true for all of these groups. If there is a monk or a nun in the room, the amplification is turned off, even if there is amplification. And because of that particular rule, Stanakavasis tend not to use amplification because of the performance usually being in a stana. So there's actually some sort of relationship to that rule, monastic rule about electrical devices. And the other thing that's different is they don't sing, obviously, things like the song to particular images, right? You're not going to have that. They do sometimes sing to sites, a little bit. But mostly it's usually more abstract or actually devotional songs about particular jinas in the sort of story narrative sense rather than this image right here. Okay. So that's that. And then in terms of the difference with Marwari, particularly Marwari performance, which is the one I've heard the most of others. In Marwari performance, the vocal quality is drawn, it is drawn from the sort of Shekhawati style of folk music. If you consider that's meaningful to you. If it's not, I'm sorry. And so it is, and it's very rhythmic. It's actually more rhythmic and very quick. And so because it will, you know when they'll do the swinging of the bells and they'll do all the Rajasthani idiophone stuff. Okay, the swing, if you've ever seen them doing the swinging of the bells, sometimes some of the more professional mandals will do that. And then you'll certainly hear that it'll be that much quicker rhythmic structure and it'll be a little more divided in the sound stuff. And then in addition to it, vocally it's even more throaty. If you can, it's a little rougher, a little less sweet sounding. The way actually that Marwari is spoken a little further back in the mouth. Yeah, so it's a little bit raspier across the board. And when they sing each other's music, Marwari groups will try to they raise the pitch when they're doing a Gujarati song, and the Gujaratis will lower the pitch a little when they sing a Marwari song. So they're trying to recognize the other aesthetic. It usually goes that the Gujaratis play the Marwari song because they think of them as cool. They are cool. And they're lively. They're a little bit more upbeat. So you want to perk up the bhavana at night. You do that. So they are aware of each other too.
Right. What I find interesting is when I've heard that there's a lot of the songs imitating a Bollywood song, the image of a Bollywood song or film song, and then they're adopting that into.
Absolutely. And you do get that too.
I'm like, oh, I know that too from meaning something completely different, but they like that too.
Right. Those don't survive.
No, they can be popular. I find it ironic to be heard in a Islamic setting.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't tell you, I'll be amusing. You're sitting in a sort of a religious setting and you're hearing, a resetting of Chole Ke Piche or something. You're like, oh my God, really? And that's been common through the whole time period. They don't survive, and I think that's a part of it, is that those are very short-lived, the way that a lot of commercial song overwrites, sort of the equivalent of the mashup, right? They don't last that long. A couple have been survived a little longer, like things written to Ek Do Teen have survived. There's still tons and tons of religious music written to that song. That song worked.
Well, thank you for answering all the questions. Just finally, so basically you haven't seen too much of a backlash with people who are against singing or not for the singing, or there hasn't been any of usually I haven't seen anything like that, but I was wondering from what you
against singing the Hindi film melodies?
No, not the film melody, just singing.
Once in a while that gets brought up in a book. It'll say we shouldn't be singing the Hindi film.
Right.
Nobody pays
just
attention.
Just singing or playing music in general, anywhere.
No, there isn't. I have not encountered any. So in the diminishing, when I've asked people about there being less singing or something in context, and that's a place where it might come up, it's never been that. It's always been, oh, it's unfortunate. Young people don't know how to sing, or that kind of language. Not, oh, it's we don't do that anymore. Singing is still carries with it that auspiciousness that makes it a valuable practice. And I haven't seen a rejection against it. That being said, the most likely group to resist it is probably Terapanthis, and they're the group I know the least. So I would have to defer to people who spend time there on that particular piece of it. But I know that in the communities, and including in Digambar communities, I haven't seen a resistance against singing. I've seen a slight diminishing of the sort of music scape. I think you had your hand up in there. The two of you, I don't know, you were a tie.
Whitney, the singing of the devotional songs, many occasions in the Jain tradition. It could be on a daily puja.
Yeah.
It could be on a special puja. It could be in the temple. It could be in front of the monks when they come, or they arrive, or when they are there. It could be when they have a pratishtha, Panchkalyana, Diksha.
Oh yeah.
Diksha also.
Right.
And also during when there is a death ceremony.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you see any special trends between all of these from one event to the other?
Oh, that's great. Okay, so Gaulis, the songs when monks arrive, are a special genre of songs. Sometimes people will sing a standard song also, but there is actually a genre for Here is a Monk. There's also a genre, there's Diksha Geet and there's Tapasya Geet, so songs for Dikshas, for the renunciation ceremony, songs for people who are doing fasts that are separate repertoire from the other repertoire, actually.
On fasting.
Yeah, and fasting, there's a lot of singing during fasting to keep the fasting person in a good, sort of good, auspicious headspace and also healthy with
And
the
now
kind of
even
blessings.
during Santara.
Yes, and then there's also a genre for that as well, for Santara. So there are actually separate genres of song for those different events. Musicologically, they sound like the upbeat end of the solo singing, okay? They're usually actually pretty perky, and I think because most of the time they're supposed to sort of keep people lively during events. And so, yeah, so those are fairly stable. But what I've always found is that they were always tricky. So they haven't changed, but that's partly because they've always been a difficult genre. People don't sing them often enough, except for the fasting songs. People actually have to look up the words.
But don't you see the role of more and more professionals coming up as the...
You can't play recordings if there's a monk in the room.
No, but in other
Right?
events.
What's interesting to me is that the Gaulis and the Diksha Geet and the Santaras, like, you can't play recordings during those events. So those actually are stable, relatively stable musically. You will get them sometimes in parades, processions you'll have it, but usually they have a marching band playing songs, and those are often not Jain at all. I mean, they routinely are playing tequila and songs like this while they're marching through the street at a Diksha, and if you know the genres, it's very amusing. But what I have found is where you see the professionals is in large-scale pujas and in bhavana. That's where you see more professionalization of single vocalists with amplification and instrumentation. But that was true on a smaller scale, but that's expanded for sure. The other genres are actually fairly stable, and I think it's because of the rules, the ethical rules about electricity especially, have actually kept a conservative musicological space around anything related to monks, actually. And also, sometimes you'll hear at the fast breaking day, if there's no monk coming, sometimes there'll be some kind of amplification. But that's also fairly conservative repertoire. Chris.
Yeah, in the book, you have these beautiful descriptions of women singing in clubs.
Yes.
And coming with their notebooks about,
yeah, they still
I made up this new song. And they
still do that, but it's not young people. So that is aging. And I think some of that has to do with that there's more entertainment, that there's more ability, at least in the cities. I'd probably, if I were to pursue this more, one of the things I'd want to do is go see whether in the smaller towns, whether the young women are joining the groups. They're not in the city. They are not at all. They'll do religious practices, but they don't do that particular practice. And that, I think, was, it was an escape valve in part from it was a way to have fun that nobody could tell you couldn't do, right? You could always say, I'm going to a puja, and really, who's going to tell you that you shouldn't be going to a puja? And so there were ways in which that bought women space to do things that were fun when the labor of a joint family might have made that difficult. Fewer and fewer people are living in joint families also, which actually means women are tied to the home more, right? Because the rules about whether they have to be home for a guest are still there. They just don't have a sister-in-law to cover for them. So I see it, so there are a couple of shifts that look like they were going to be freeing that I think are actually pretty constraining, and I see that impact on the music performance especially. So yeah, they still do write them for like dikshas and fasting. You'll see people still write them, but not as much as they used to. We're good? All right, cool. Thank you.